both a sort of equality envisioned there, that both are included in the description, and you have a man and his wife. So it's, God could have said the man should leave his father and go marry his wife, right? But he says father and mother. Exodus 20, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So there is to be an equal degree of honor given to father and mother. Leviticus 19, every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Same concept as Exodus 20. Proverbs 6:20, my son, keep your father's commandments and forsake not your mother's teaching. So the mother here is given the same value when it comes to her instruction and teaching and how it is to be received by the son. Proverbs 18:22, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. That verse could also be translated that a wife is a gift to her husband. So men, your wife is a gift to you. God hand-selected and wrapped up and delivered to you a gift that is meant to be received and with joy and seen as of great value. And you could certainly flip it the other way, right? Your husband is God's gift to you. Proverbs 19:26, he who does violence to his father and chases away his mother is a son who brings shame and reproach. So again, both mentioned there. Proverbs 19, we repeated that one. Okay, put that one in there twice. Proverbs 23:22 and 25, listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Let your father and mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice. And then Song of Songs 6:3, I am my beloved's, my beloved is mine. He grazes among the lilies. This kind of mutual, I am yours, you are mine. So there is this equality, basic equality between men and women that is established in the fact that they're made in the image of God, that they share the roles of parenting and share their responsibility for love and marriage and those types of things. So a couple good quotes here. Dorothy Sayers, women are more like men than anything else in the world. They are human beings. Pretty simple, but good to say, and because some people think that maybe the Bible is communicating that women are somehow lesser, of lesser value, of somehow created secondarily or something like that. Now, it does say in the creation account that women are taken, formed out of the rib of man, and sometimes people use that to teach some sort of, that the woman therefore is some sub-derivation. But I like this quote from Matthew Henry. Eve was not taken out of Adam's head to top him, neither out of his feet to be trampled on by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arm to be protected by him, and near his heart to be loved by him. Isn't that such a great quote? That's one of my favorite quotes. So that's the ideal, right? That you could go to the New Testament and look at Ephesians 5, where it talks about, before it says, wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord, and husbands love your wives. There is this, it says that submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. There is a mutual submission that comes first before he then goes to say, wives, submit to your husbands. There is. So it's not as if to say, wives submit, husbands never have to, and husbands love, wives never have to, right? There's this mutual submission, mutual love, what we would call both an equality, and then we're not. This is not really about. This is not tonight's what we're talking about, but in our church we believe in what's called complementarianism, and so there is still appropriate roles for husbands and wives, but that does not communicate that they're not equal. And the other view is called egalitarianism, which communicates by the word inequality, but we're saying no, there is a biblical ideal in which men and women are made in the image of God together and share in all of these things, and yet the Bible also has distinct roles for both. And when those go together, that in the ideal scenario, that women should not feel subjugated or controlled or demeaned or anything like that. Now, we recognize that that certainly can happen and does happen, and we'll see how we fall short of. We see the Bible describing areas in which when people fall short of that ideal. But that's God's ideal. That's how He created the world. That's how He intended it for it to be. And so when He gave laws to Israel that were around this issue of how women were to be treated, cared for, protected, how those interactions are to go, there's two things we can say. One, when He gives those laws at that particular moment in history, He's working with and in the current norms of that time to point to a better path, right? So we see that we'll look at, what was the kind of normal, expected way that women would be treated at that time, and God is working within that. He's always working within the particular historical moment, but pointing to a better path, pointing toward the ideal. And so we talked about in the first class this idea of incremental progression that God is moving us along in a kind of progressive way toward the ideal, rather than just saying going from 0 to 100 right away. And then second, that when you look at these laws, they actually provide many protections and controls against abuse. So in the context of what is going on around them, they actually are very protective and guard against the abuse of women. And for example, in the area of widows and how widows are to be cared for and provided for women who are divorced. God is described as a God of justice for the weak and for the defenseless, and that would include especially women in that time, because they relied on their marriage, they relied on their relationship to their family for that social safety net. So let's look at how do we think about the idea of patriarchy? Because at that time and in that culture, and even in some cultures today, there was a different way of structuring society than what we experience here in 21st century America, where the men were given particular responsibilities for the entire family, the immediate and the extended family. Sometimes the father figure, the male leader, would be responsible, for 20, 30 people as part of the whole clan or family. And so this is the system in which God is giving these laws, and we said we know the ideal, but something that's good to say is that, sometimes we hear the word patriarchy and we think that must be a bad thing. But we shouldn't automatically assume that women considered this an oppressive arrangement, right? And so, for example, think of Proverbs 31. The woman who is described as caring for her household and showing all kinds of grace and wisdom in how she lives in a patriarchal society, and yet there's no sense that she's unhappy about that, or that she, so, and that's not to say, okay, so we're like, let's go back to a kind of, there's the abuse, and then there's this, beautiful biblical picture that God is trying to paint and working with it in the situation. So there certainly were, at that time, abuses of patriarchy. But God is working in that system to say there are ways in which I've created the husband to be a leader, the man to lead the family, and in that situation to work and operate together. So it is good to, we talked about in the first class, to not have a chronological kind of snobbery, right? To automatically think, oh, we are just so much more enlightened than they were. And to evaluate what's going on against our modern standards. So if our modern standard is a more of kind of women's rights, women's empowerment type thing, with no comment on how good or bad that is, or biblical that is, it would be easy just to take that, just to say whatever our current kind of view of how women should be treated, let's compare the Bible to that, rather than saying, well, let's compare what we see in the Bible described to the ideal, right? That to what God describes as his ideal, and so that if we see what's operating in these passages, there might be places where we might go, oh, that's actually, that gets closer to the ideal, and there'd be other places where we go, and that's further away, and then we can think about how it relates to our current kind of cultural moment. Because there are certainly ways in which our current cultural moment is different from God's ideal. And so it's not necessarily true that we're more enlightened, therefore we have it better. But what can we say about some of these passages, or some of these ways it's described? One would be when the woman is described as a helper or a helpmate, and that's in Genesis 2. When it's not good that the man should be alone, I'll find him a helper, a helpmate fit for him, or suitable for him. That word helper, is good to remember, is not communicating inferiority, like she's his servant. But rather, that word helper is actually used to describe God in other places in the Old Testament. That God is our help. He comes to us and in our time of need, right? He's our helper, and so it more communicates that that the woman has something that the man needs, right? And he is incomplete without her. She's a gift to him that God intentionally gave for some area in his life that he needs a helper, and so and not just a servant. You could also consider that in the Old Testament there are many powerful matriarchs, women who, through their faithfulness, through their actions of obedience, are commended and put forward as examples for men and women, right? So they're part of why the story even progresses in the first place. Without these women, the biblical story, would not progress forward. So you have Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Shiphrah and Puah, who were the Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1, saving the Jewish children. You have Miriam, Jethro's daughters, Deborah, Ruth, Abigail, and so the Bible puts forth these women as those who trusted the Lord, followed the Lord, not perfectly, but just as powerfully as the patriarchs did. You have these matriarchs. And so we did a sermon series one time called "The Mothers of Jesus," right? And when you look at the genealogy of Jesus in the New Testament, you're surprised to see that there are women in it, and that would have been a shocking thing to do, because when you're writing a genealogy in New Testament times, if you want to give utter kind of validity and trustworthiness to it, you would not include women because the way they were viewed by the culture as not carrying the same kind of legal weight as a witness to something. And yet there they are in the genealogy, and there they are as Jesus' disciples and witnesses to his resurrection. And so the New Testament carries on the Old Testament's speaking of women of faith. And then it's good to remember that women in the Old Testament shared the same moral responsibility with the men. Right? There was no difference when it came to, there might have been some differences when it came to ceremonial things and in some leadership areas, but they had the same moral responsibility. They had to follow the Ten Commandments just like the men did. They had to be responsible for their activity and whatnot, just like the men. So they shared equally in that. All right. Any questions thus far? No?
But would you say it was true that if the moral laws were broken, women were treated differently than the men?
She asked, is it true that were the women treated differently than men in the consequences if they broke those laws? I'd have to look at and set some examples and see. Maybe if you find them, show them to me.
Like adultery. The men weren't stoned, were they?
In the case of adultery, I'd have to look at that. Yeah, I think you're right, but I'd have to look at that more closely to see if what that's saying, if that's. However, there are laws, and we're going to look at them tonight, where the man is actually held guilty for that. And so I do think it cuts both ways on that. It just might be that in a particular passage, it's only maybe talking about the woman, but I'd have to look at that. But we will look at one tonight that shows that actually in a case the man bears a greater responsibility than the woman. Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Let's ask the question. This is page 18. Why were there no female priests? That would be perhaps a question that a modern reader would bring to the text in a world in which we are used to female CEOs and leaders and things like that. So why in this particular area of leadership in the history of Israel and the life of Israel, why no female priests? Wouldn't that be an area of disequality? And it's good to point out that most males were excluded as well, right? So it wasn't just that all the men could be priests and none of the women could. Actually, the only men who could be priests were those from the tribe of Levi and those who were descended from Aaron. And so actually most of the Israelites were excluded from being priests. But why still just only men? Let's think first about the ideal. So in Exodus 19, I didn't write the verse down, but maybe I could find it real quick. Let's see. Yeah, Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, this is Israel at Mount Sinai, right before he's going to give the Ten Commandments. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God is speaking there to the whole people. So there is a biblical ideal of that every person is really meant to be a priest as far as their how they are to relate to God and relate to the world. But then that ideal is then in this situation, they fall short of this ideal, and so God gives them a sacrificial system in which only the male Aaronic men can be priests. But what we discover is that this ideal is actually picked back up and you might say fulfilled in the New Testament. So 1 Peter 2 verse 9 says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light." That Christians are called a royal priesthood, just as the Old Testament Israelites were to be a kingdom of priests. And so, and we know that the priesthood comes to an end. Now, we could talk about, and we're not really going to get into, I've done a whole class on what about female pastors, right? And so our particular denomination believes that role is reserved for called and qualified men. However, I do want to say, and is it here that I wanted to say it, or yeah, I think it is, and I think I just didn't write it down, is that let me hold off on that and just finish this and then come back to it. I'm going to make a note, because I feel like I wrote this down somewhere. I just don't want to preempt myself. Nope, okay. So, let me say first, what was the context? How were women treated in other religions in the ancient Near East, and what did they do? Well, it was actually common, very common, if not that you would have priestesses in these other ancient Near East religions. In their temples of worship, there were priestesses, there were women priests. And the reason that they were there was because it was a kind of fertility cult. So you'd have the idea of like a temple prostitute, that you would go and not just offer sacrifices, but you would have these activities with the priestesses as a way of trying to get the gods or goddesses to respond to your needs. And so that was what was common in the ancient years. So the Israelites look around, and it's very common to have priestesses, and that's what they're used for. And so I thought this was interesting. We could say that in that sense, the ancient Near Eastern world was very tolerant, right? They said, sure, women can be priests too, but tolerant in all the wrong ways, right? In ways in which they were used and abused. And so, we could say, tolerance is such a good thing, and that's what we want today, isn't it? Well, in this case, what looks like the Bible being intolerant or being regressive by having it just be the men be priests was actually a way to protect the women, and actually a way to distinguish and set apart Israel as operating in a different way than the rest of the world and the other religions. So Copen describes it well, when he says, "The law of Moses sought to prevent Israelites from glorifying adultery," because that was the idea. You could go into these other temples of these other gods and essentially commit adultery without any repercussion because you're worshiping. I mean, maybe for them, but for these other religions, it was, if your husband goes to go worship, you can kind of assume what he's going to do. And so, the law of Moses sought to prevent Israelites from glorifying adultery or worse in the name of religious devotion. Keeping an all-male priesthood then helped create this kind of religious distinction as well as preserved the sanctity of marriage. It wasn't a slam against women. It was a matter of preserving religious purity and sanctity of sex within marriage. It was a matter of Israel's religious identity and moral well-being. So I thought that was really helpful perspective on that. Now, what might we say if we're going to equate the role of priest and pastor, which I'm not sure that I would, but at least we would say, okay, but in our current context, why not women pastors? Well, we won't get into the details of that. We think that that's what the Bible, the New Testament, prescribes as God's as what God says is the right thing to do. But we do like to start by saying, not emphasizing what can a woman not do in the church, but what can she do, right? And the answer to that is a woman in the church can do anything that a non-ordained man can do. And in some ways, that was kind of the same thing in Israel. Like a woman in Israel could do anything that a non-priest man could do. And so in the church, we say a woman can do anything a non-ordained man can do. So a man doesn't have to be ordained to read the scripture before the sermon. So we have women read scripture before the sermon. A man doesn't have to be ordained to be part of the communion team up here. We have elders who do the elements and then they distribute them through non-ordained couples. So it's not just men, but men and women. A man doesn't have to be ordained to be on a ministry team, to be on the church staff, to be a small group leader, and so the ordained ones are the deacons, the elders, the pastors, but any other role that's open to a non-ordained man is also open to a woman. In our church, there are some PCA churches that would have some restrictions on that, but we hold it open by saying that. Okay, and then let's talk about polygamy, and then we'll see if you have any questions about those. So what about polygamy? Multiple wives, and how do we square that? And I read an interesting story. I didn't know. So I knew some of it, not all of it. So you might know that Thomas Jefferson was claimed that he had taken advantage of his, or maybe it wasn't taking advantage, that he had a child with one of his slave girls, and Sally Hemings, I think, and so this came up some couple decades ago, maybe in the 90s, as people were considering the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, and maybe he wasn't as great of a guy as we think, because look, he slept with his slave and had a child, and well, it turns out that after more research and some more study into it, that the most likely reason, the most likely thing that happened was it was not Thomas Jefferson, but it was his younger brother, Randolph Jefferson. Because at that time that it's said that this might have happened, Thomas Jefferson was like 65, and he was dealing with some significant health issues, and had migraines all the time. But his younger brother Randolph was an alcoholic and kind of a debaucherous person, and was around at the same time. And so now historians believe that it was actually his younger brother that had the child with Sally Hemings. Either way, let's assume it was Thomas Jefferson. And would his moral failings in that area then negate what he wrote in in our constitutional documents, right, and in our Declaration of Independence, of that all men and women are created equal? Well, no, those things would still be true despite Thomas Jefferson's moral failures. And so when we look at the Bible, we might see lots of moral failures from biblical characters, and yet God's ideal, what he prescribes in his word, is still true, despite his people not keeping it. And so we could, that would be a perhaps an analogy or an illustration for that. The difference between is and ought, as we said, that these things, when we see polygamy in the Bible, it does not mean that it has God's stamp of approval. In fact, there are some laws in the Bible that we call case law, which is the laws given in case what should be done under inferior circumstances. So it's not claiming that the circumstances are ideal, but rather what should be done in case these things happen. In the ancient Near East, polygamy was taken for granted. It was just assumed that you would have multiple wives. However, God's ideal in the Bible is one man and one woman. Now, we very quickly in the book of Genesis see that ideal being broken, and so Lamech is the first one to do that. He takes 2 wives. As you read through the Old Testament and you see characters taking multiple wives, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the importance of having children, that to not have a child means to be left out of the promises of God, to not have an inheritance, to not have an heir. So it felt, where we have couples today that would not feel so much of a burden to, have a child, like we want to just be us. There was more of this burden on people in the ancient Near East. The survival was really what they're talking about. The survival of them, their family, the passing down of their land rested on having children. And so it's not surprising to see people taking second wives because their first wife was infertile. And we see that in the biblical story many different times. Also, you would take multiple wives for political alliances. David and Solomon did that. Again, no comment on or no stamp of approval on that, but those are reasons why they did it. The question is asked, well, what about Solomon? Solomon, the Bible says, had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which having 700 wives doesn't sound like that great of a thing to me. That would be quite the thing to juggle. So, but interestingly, Deuteronomy 17:17 says, gives the ideal. Here's the prescription. Deuteronomy 17:17, speaking of the king, he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And so, what do we see? The Bible actually describes this, that Solomon's many wives turned his heart away from the Lord. And this is just an interesting paradox, that despite being super wise, right? He asks the Lord for wisdom, and he gives it to him in an extraordinary way, a unique, special way. Solomon was wiser than anyone else who ever lived. And yet, his wisdom never got to that area of his life of having 700 wives and 300 concubines. And so God said, don't do that, or it will not go well. And what do we see in the biblical story? It doesn't go well. The unified kingdom comes to an end with Solomon's sons. And so there's that difference between the ideal and what actually happens in the scriptures. Whenever God's ideal is ignored, what do you discover? Strife, competition, disharmony. God prohibited it, but they did it anyway. And yet God continued to move the story forward. Isn't that, though, a bit encouraging, because God, in his grace and mercy, didn't just, annihilate Solomon for his sin. And so many areas in our lives where it's not the ideal, not commended at all. There are repercussions for our decisions and our sinful actions. And yet God, in his mercy and his kindness, still keeps moving our story forward. He gives us grace. He doesn't forsake us. And so he both upholds his holiness and his justice, says this is wrong. And yet when we turn to him, he's always willing to give us grace. So I want to do a little case study in Deuteronomy on a passage that that I think communicates something about the value of that women are to be given, and it's just a neat little story. So take a minute on your own with someone who's near you. Read Deuteronomy 21, 15 through 17, and then see if you might come up with what are a couple themes or key concepts that this law seems to be there to protect women, communicate their dignity, value, that kind of thing. Why do you think God gave this law? What was he trying to do in giving it? So take a couple minutes and do that. Okay. So, so what's going on here? Why did God give this law? What do you think? You can't love two women at the same time. Okay. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. More apt to give the son of the woman he loved more than the son he didn't love, even though he's the firstborn. And so what is this law trying to curb, or uh, what is it trying to work against? Yeah, inequality or favoritism, right?
But wouldn't it also kind of protect the unloved wife
Yes,
when he dies?
yes.
Because then she would at least have an heir who would have something to take care of her.
Yeah, he's saying it would also protect the unloved wife, because then her son would have, if he died. Yeah, yeah, it protects against favoritism. Yes, ma'am.
What I don't get is it seems like the firstborn is really important when there's two wives involved. But when there's one wife involved, then it's the firstborn doesn't matter so much because the secondborn got the.
Yeah. So that's good. So yeah, there is this theme in the Bible of that while the traditional kind of way things goes is that the firstborn gets the double portion, the blessing, the inheritance, that what do you see over and over again? Examples of the secondborn getting it either because through treachery, that was the case with Jacob, or just because that's how God wanted it to be. And there's a lesson in there that has to. But that's a common theme in the Bible. Yeah, you have both things going on. This is kind of like the typical, the normal, but there are times where God kind of writes the story differently. So this law here is actually a kindness from God that He's seeking to tell His people, listen, don't play favorites, right? But here's a question that a skeptic might say is, well, but isn't this verse subtly or inferring polygamy in its own way? Like, isn't it communicating that bigamy, in this case having two wives, is okay because it says if you have two wives? It does. It can sound that way. Yeah. So what's the answer to that? That's my job. What do you think? Yes, sir. Okay, so multiple marriages, divorce, multiple families. Yeah. Yes, Rick. Okay, so. Okay, so an appeal to the sovereignty of God, yes. Yeah, okay, so it says God remembers that we're sinful and we're human and will do things such as this. Yes, ma'am? I think by double portion, it's communicating more than 50-50. Yeah, so there's still some left, and that would be even that's in the parable of the prodigal son. It seems that he gives he actually gives that to the younger son. You know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It's a good question. So here, let me say, yes, sir. Yes. Okay. So those two things. So one, this is an example of what I said is called case law, right? In the case that is not the same as saying you should do this, right? So another example of case law would be if your ox kills your neighbor, you have to do something about that, right? There's some restitution that has to be done. Well, that's an if, right? It's not saying your ox should kill you, you should let that happen, or it's a case law, an in case. And so it's just saying, like I think what kind of you were saying, this is the reality that the people are living in, and it's kind of saying, one way to interpret this, if you have two wives, you shouldn't have two wives. But if you do, and you could even think of, there was some missionary thinking through implications of the gospel when the gospel goes into areas of the world where polygamy is active, and now the tribe, the husband, the couple, whatever. Let's say the man who has multiple wives because it's polygamous. The man becomes converted to Christianity. Okay, polygamy is not the ideal. What is he supposed to do? He's got 4 wives. What is he supposed to do with 3 of them? Throw them out on the street? It would seem like a Christian thing to do would be to care for them. But what is see how this gets messy quickly, right? And that's the same thing here with this case law. Like, if you have 2 wives, okay, realize that the temptation is going to be to show favor to the son of the one that you love the most. We actually see that with Rachel and Leah, right? Okay, so the other way to interpret this is it actually doesn't say that you have these 2 wives at the same time. It is possible that if you have 2 wives and the one has died, and you have children from both those wives, you might just have 1 wife at the time, but maybe you loved the first wife more than your current wife. And so you would be tempted to show favor to the new son over the son whose mother had died. So anyway, those are 2 ways to look at this passage. And either way, what are we seeing here? That God is wanting to step into a system and move it along towards the ideal that he's designed. Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
Isn't it true that Moses diluted some of those laws to adjust to the realities of the situation?
That Moses diluted them? And where to adjust to the reality of the situation? And what would lead you to think that?
For example, when he permits them to have the 2 wives,
Right.
that would be one of
Well, you're making me think of, and I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but we did talk about that in Matthew 19. Yep. So here, Matthew 19, verse 6, God says, "What therefore God has joined together," he's talking about divorce, "let no man separate." That's the ideal. The ideal is 1 man, 1 woman in the covenant of marriage till death do us part. Ideal. Then he says, well, they said, "Why did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And he said to them, "Because of your hardness of hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." And I think we talked about that in class. This idea of, again, that incremental improvement, that they're meeting them where they were at and moving them forward, rather than kind of wholesale dragging them to perfection. I just don't know in that text when it says, I'd have to look at it more closely, but when it says, "Why did Moses command?" and then he says, "Moses allowed you." I don't know that that's making any comment on that Moses himself took on himself to dilute it, but rather that Moses, as the vehicle through which God gave these commandments, did that. Does that make sense? So I would be hesitant to say that Moses somehow, I mean, he could have, I guess, but that relaxed it or did something that would have been adding or deleting from God's word. I think it's more speaking of him as the vehicle. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. It's a good question. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, yeah, that's what it says. Yeah. Yep. Yep. What's that? What's that? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the reason. That's the reason why. Yeah, we talked about how our hearts are so hard that God doesn't reveal all of our sin to us all at once. Otherwise, we would just probably despair. But He's kind and gracious to slowly sanctify us and bring us along. Anything else? Okay, this is fun. Let's keep going. Let's look at page 19 and talk about two more things, questions that come up. First, the bride price. The bride price. What is the bride price? The bride price was an amount of money or some sort of economic gift given before the wedding from the wife, from the bride's family to the husband's family. I always have to think carefully about that because the dowry system that we have in modern times goes the other way, right? Typically, it's the man's family that gives it to the bride's, but biblically, it's the other way around. And so this could be interpreted as is this woman then like a piece of property? Is she being bought? Are you buying a wife like you would buy a horse or a mule? I mean, it feels demeaning, right? That would be the argument that, wow, that's pretty demeaning to have that. Well, the bride price acted, you can think of it as a marriage gift. That would be one way to think of it. You can think of it as a deposit, right? So it communicated to the family the man's serious intentions to carry through. This bride price brought the two families together. It was a means of actually bringing two families into one. This would go to the. This would be the family of the boy, and maybe, so correct me if I said this backwards, the family of the boy giving it to the family of the girl. Is that how I said it, or did I say it backwards? I said it correctly? Okay, then it's the other way around. It's the other way around. It's the family of the boy giving it to the family of the girl. Okay, there we go. Right? No, the other way around. Yes. It's the in this case, in the biblical case, because here's how it worked. It provided economic stability for that family because if your daughter's going to be married away, and if somebody finds the scripture, tell me, but because I don't have it written down. But what I read in the commentary is that it provides financial stability for the family because your daughter now is not going to be working in the household anymore. And so it would be a couple years worth of wages that would be given, this bride price, right? And perhaps that's why it's called a bride price, because it's given for the bride, so given to her family. And now she's going to leave the house. She's going to be married to this man. And so her contribution to the household is now going to go away. So this amount also acts as an economic stabilizer for her family. And it was common that there'd be another gift of property even given after, when they were actually married. What I read is that this money would be held in security, so it becomes almost like an emergency fund, I wrote down it's kind of like the opposite of a prenup, right? instead of kind of protecting yourself by holding your money back, you're giving it away. And so, yeah. Does anybody find where it is? Rick, you found it. Okay, Genesis 34:12. Okay, let's look at it. So this is, this is a really challenging passage, but this has to do with Hamor, the father of Shechem, asking for Dinah to be his wife. Hamor, I'm looking at verse 8. Hamor spoke with them, spoke with Jacob and his sons, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him to be his wife. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall dwell with us. The land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it. Get property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes. Whatever you say to me, I will give. Ask me for as great a bride price and gift as you will, and I will give whatever you say to me. Only give the young woman to be my wife." So in this case, it looks like, even though it could still be coming from his father, it looks like the son who wants to marry the girl is offering the bride price to the girl's father and to his family. So in that case, it would be the question comes, oh, is he just buying her? But in that culture, there was a little more going on with that. The reason why they had this bride price in place. There could be some there if, let's say you give the bride price, the woman's given to you in marriage, and then you die. What happens to this woman? Right? There's a little bit of security there that this money has been exchanged, that the father of the girl who's now a widow, can help take care of her. So, that's an interesting passage. Yes, ma'am.
When I think of the bride price, it makes me think of the price that Jesus paid for us,
Hmm.
bride, church.
Hmm.
Do you think maybe that's just kind of like a representation, foreshadowing like what Jesus did for us, his bride? Because a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament to me points to.
I've never thought about that, and I don't know. I see where you're going. I see what you're saying. Just connecting the words bride, and I don't know. I've never thought whether that's an accurate thing to say or not. I mean, I like how you're thinking, but I don't know if that's what it's intended to. If that's meant to be a foreshadowing or some sort of something that's fulfilled by Christ. What I really like is redemptive creativity. I'd rather us be, curious and redemptively creative at wondering, I wonder if this is, and get it wrong, than be so scared of getting it wrong that we never even try. So maybe, but I like the thought. I like the thinking. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, it is interesting to think about. Yeah, she asked about the man leaves the father and the mother and cleaves to his wife. What is that? But we're talking about here about a woman leaving her father and mother. And so let me think. There's probably some co-leaving that's expected. There's some circumstantial things. However, you did make me think of when Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you, and I'll come back and take you to be with myself. That language is reflective of at least custom at that time. I don't know if that would have been custom in Abraham's time, but custom at that time that a young man would still be on would still live on his father's property, even a part of his house, but he would actually build onto his father's house. So I go to prepare a place for you. They would know what that meant, because the way that weddings would go is the son would be preparing this, creating this suite connected to his father's house he then, when it was ready, he would get his bride and they would live there. And so it was much more communal, family oriented. So in that case, what does leaving father and mother mean? It probably has more of a authority and spiritual aspect than a physical one, because they're still there. And today we're like, get out, don't go, don't come back, right? Go live your life. So, yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. There was arranged marriages, and that's still the case in many places of the world today. Yep.
Is this a cultural thing for all the other nations around there too, or were these laws written just for Israel because they were the only people that did this?
I don't know about the bride price one. I don't know if that was done by other. He's asking, was this done by other nations around, or I don't know on that one. I can say that in this general area of how women were treated, when you compare, and this is the case in what we were talking about on some of these other things too, when we look at slavery, and that in general, if you just lay side by side, say the Code of Hammurabi and the Old Testament laws, that the Old Testament laws are much more, much less severe, much more restrained, much more room for even that concept of, we skipped over that, and we said we'd talk about in the last class about what about these laws that seem to have extreme penalties for them when you break them. And even in what looks like extreme penalties compared to what was actually going on in the other nations around them, it's far less. So, but yeah, we'll look at that more in the last class. Okay, last one here. What about sexual violence in the Old Testament? Difficult things to talk about, but there are very difficult things in the Bible. In fact, we were just looking at, we didn't read it, but that story with Dinah is one of those areas. The accusation that's leveled is that the Old Testament permits sexual violence, permits, for example, rape. And so I want you to do the same, do an exercise like you just did with the last one in Deuteronomy 22. So if you look at page 20 of your notes, you see there Deuteronomy 22, 23 through 29, and you see that it's broken into 3 paragraphs. And this represents, each paragraph represents a law, a unique situation that's being addressed with a unique law. And so I want you to go through that and see if you can figure out what are the 3 unique situations, how do circumstances differ, and what is the consequence given in each case. All right, so take a few minutes to do that. Betrothed, by the way, you could, it's not exactly a equal equivalent, but you could put in the word engaged there. Let's look at this. Okay, so I think what I like about this, these three successive passages here, verses, is that it shows that the Old Testament law was not simplistic, right? It is actually accounting for many different situations. And so the first situation here, if there's a betrothed virgin, a man meets her in the city, lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. What does this law have in vision? What does it have? What situation is it addressing? Adultery between consenting adults. Yeah. So that could be, a little question, because it says she did not cry for help, but it doesn't seem to be communicating that because she was being violated, but rather that she didn't fight against it, right? Not like she was being forced, but rather she was consenting. Yes, sir.
To that point on the first one, it only uses the verb lies. It doesn't say seizes and lies.
Good observation. It just says lies. Yes, the other one says seizes and lies. So these first two verses are dealing with adultery between consenting adults. You have a man, presumably married, and you have a engaged woman. So there, who is punished? Yeah, both of them, right? So the adultery in that scenario is on both. The punishment's on both, not just on the woman. Okay. The next section there. If in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her, lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman; she's committed no offense punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor, because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. So what is this envisioning? Yeah, this is a situation of rape, what we would call statutory rape. You have a woman who's to be engaged, or who is engaged to be betrothed, and a man. So in that case, only the man is punished, right? Because she hasn't done anything wrong. She's been violated. She's been sinned against. And even if she cried out, there was no one, right? Though she cried out, there was no one there to rescue her. Okay, and the last one, let me do this. Read, if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. And let me read to you the parallel one in Exodus 22. It says this, it might bring a little more clarity. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. So what is this third category? If we have adultery between consenting adults, we have forced violence in the second one. What is this third one? What do you think?
She's forced violence again, but this time she wasn't betrothed.
She's not betrothed, so you have an unengaged woman. That's a difference.
And it doesn't imply that there's any difference whether it's in the city or outside the
Yeah.
It applies to both circumstances.
There's nothing inside or outside. Yes. What was somebody else going to say? Okay, so the man has to pay here, and yeah, there's punishment and there's financial responsibility laid on this man. So I should have printed for you the Exodus one, but listen again. In Exodus, you put these next to each other, and it helps clarify if a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her. That's the situation. So even though it says here, seizes her and lies with her, despite, and I'd have to look at the original, if the original word's the same, but the concept here is that you've got three different situations. You've got adultery between consenting adults, you've got a forced violence situation, and you've got a man who seduces a young woman who's not engaged, so there is a component of that he initiates, but she is also here considered what? Complicit in a way in the situation. Like, so it's not a forced situation when you put these two passages together. He is certainly carries a responsibility, and what this Exodus one says is he should give the bride price to make her his wife, but the father can refuse, and he still has to pay the bride price. So he's held to a higher standard in this sense. He is guilty because he initiated. She's not fully innocent, we might say, in this situation, and because she's not engaged, the expectation is that you guys should get married, you know, and this guy is going to have to pay either way, depending on whether the father allows it or not. Yes, she would be considered damaged goods, or she would not, her future bride price would be in jeopardy. And so you see this law is providing for, it's actually providing protection for the woman, because he must pay the bride price and he cannot divorce her. Yes, yeah. Yeah, see, this is, the Bible's talking about, it's like a baby mama situation, right? I mean, it's kind of what it is. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Great. That is great observation, great insight. Thank you. That the amount of money being talked about here is 4 or 5 years worth of wages and hundreds of thousands of dollars. So yeah, it would make you. It is also curbing, trying to make you think twice before you go have a night out on the town. All right, and then this last one, let me just read it, and we'll go through it quickly here. This will be our last thing. Sometimes it's asked, what about women prisoners of war, women POWs? It is true that in the ancient Near East, in situations of warfare, that women were in very dangerous situation whenever another country, king, peoples would conquer you. You would be subject to these types of things that we were talking about. And so what's the expectation about the Israelites when they would go into battle? And if there were women POWs, Deuteronomy 21:10-14, when you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head, and pare her nails, and she shall, is that right? I think I just copied and pasted that. And she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother a full month. They were killed in the takeover. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. So just consider in this case, again, working within the current expectations and realities of the ancient Near East. This is actually a very humane and better situation than what would have been experienced if it had been someone other than the Israelites who had captured this girl, and he wants to marry her. So God says, let there be a cool off period, right? Let's make sure that you want to do this, and so if you want to marry her, that's fine. After a month has gone by and you've let her grieve her father and mother, but if your mind changes after a month, you need to let her go where she wants, and you cannot sell her for money. You can't treat her as a slave. You've already humiliated her by making her stay in the house for a month, and it says there, shave her head and stuff like that. This is another good example of this progressive, moving the needle towards the norm among his people. And so obviously when we get to the New Testament, it's even further down the road. And so, yeah. All right. And we will talk about some of this stuff in the next two classes, because we're going to talk about, it says there, don't treat her as a slave. So next class, we're going to talk about slavery and human trafficking, are those depicted in the Bible and encouraged. And then the final week, we'll talk about warfare. And so this kind of stuff will come up again when we talk about the killing of the Canaanites and stuff like that. So, all right, let me say a quick ending prayer for us, and we'll get out of here tonight. Lord, it really is fun to dig into your word and see how you have kindly, graciously met your people where they are, called them to something higher, better, had grace and mercy upon us when we fall far short of the ideal. And so, Lord, we want to read these laws, we want to read the Old Testament in a way that assumes your goodness, your holiness, your justice, that doesn't impugn on your character. And we admit that there are hard, difficult things in these passages. And yet, we can see that your character is maintained, and that we are called to trust you and to continue to strive ourselves towards that ideal that you have for us in the way that, in this case, women are treated in our marriages and in our church. So help us as you continue to sanctify us through your Holy Spirit, to make us more and more conforming to your standards and to your norms, for our own human flourishing and good, and for your glory as a witness to the world around us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, have a great night. See you guys this weekend. Yes, thank you. Next weekend, thank you. Is First Pray. So please come next weekend so that we can pray together. Really important that we do that as a church. And then the following week, we'll